Okay, so we are coming up on a climactic 2 chapters. And just to summarize where we've gone so far, we started off with the verse, Lo tiyeh mishakela bakara b'artzecha. You shall not have, come on, there we go. You shall not have bereaved or barren women in your land. And we said that this comes as a result of serving God. And so we went through the whole process of serving God so far, in which serving God is not just a matter of doing what you're supposed to do. That's a very, very low level of getting things done. But serving God actually has several different levels. The first level we explained is just the servant who puts their own will, their own desires aside in order to be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. But we said that's also, very simplistic in terms of the totality of the concept of service of God. Then we explain further that there needs to be not just the respect of God, and so therefore you do what you need to do. You also have to be emotionally invested, have the love of God, and to be really personally involved. And we said that this really has several different layers to it. You have the prayer, which interestingly enough, prayer is of course essential to most religions. And in Judaism, it's a catalyst into our daily routine. So it's not just prayer in terms of asking God for what we need or anything like that. It's meant to transform us to be able to bring awareness of godliness into the world so that our daily routine is more godly and so that our involvement with the world is more godly. And so this process of turning the animal soul over to a godly focused creature, which is really an essential idea in Chassidic literature, in the Tanya. But that's the reason why tefillah, we said it has the word connection. Tefillah comes from the word tofel, which means connection. And so we said this is this entire process. And so you need to have both the respect of God, that is the beginning of the relationship, and then the love which spurs it on further. And this is very similar to a relationship in which respect really is the key to any relationship. If you don't have respect, then as much passion or excitement or romance is there, it's simply not going to be able to hold, it's not going to be able to be continuous. The respect is that which keeps everything in check, and that's what fuels eventually that which can roar into the flames of passion and the excitement and that kind of thing. But that respect they're the coals of the fire, and of course the emotion is that which comes out as a result of it. And the world, of course, they think it's the entire opposite, that everything starts with love and then you go from there. Love conquers all. The fact of the matter is that we can see the results of the world's approach to relationships and the disastrous society that we're in right now. So I think that's an important point, but not specifically for here. But in the paradigm of the relationship between us and God, which the whole idea of love between a husband and wife is itself an analogy to that, they work similarly in terms of the fact that you need to have respect first, and that can drive the love and passion, the excitement. And just to show the other side of things, that if you only have the love and you do not have the respect, the results of that are typically lust. It's typically self-interest. It's typically what I feel in the relationship as opposed to the relationship as a whole, us together. And so those are very, very important ideas, but and they reflect very much in terms of what we're talking about here. So now these concepts, as they are, they're general ideas. The fact of the matter is that sometimes we're in the mood, sometimes we're not. And now we're going to start talking about that concept of, so to speak, in the mood. Inspiration, we're talking about the lack of inspiration. How do we get ourselves motivated? How do we continue to keep ourselves motivated? And for that, again, we need to understand everything works. Once we understand the systems, we have a much better idea of what's going on, so that when we find ourselves in a certain space, we can identify what that is. And this is very similar to a doctor making a diagnosis of a particular problem. When we see a particular problem, we can identify what needs to be done. And that's exactly what we're going to do over here. We're going to talk about the idea of spiritual disease. Every disease has a corollary in the spiritual world. And here specifically, we mentioned two maladies, two diseases, and they are barrenness, and the other one is being bereaved. That's not specifically a disease, of course, but here we're going to describe it as a disease that needs to be healed. And these are two processes which are within our minds. And now once we complete this chapter, we're going to understand why the Torah uses the term lo tiyeh mishakela v'akara b'artzecha, which means, we said on one hand, it means there will not be a barren woman, there will not be a bereaved woman in your land. Now we're going to explain what it means that you shall not be a bereaved woman, you shall not be a barren woman. What does that mean? That is talking about the spiritual diseases of barrenness and being bereaved. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So now we're up to chapter 8 in our little PDF. So now that we understand that, and you shall serve God refers to this type of complete service of God, encompassing both love and fear, again, awe of God. The verse continues to describe the method of divine service. You shall not be a bereaved or barren woman in your land. Now, in your land is going to be a very, very important part of this whole subject. But first, let's understand what each one of these things mean. A barren woman means a person who cannot have children. The spiritual counterpart of this disease is as follows. The sages describe children in the spiritual framework as love and awe of God, which are the results, i.e., the children of one's contemplation in these matters. Love is the analog of a son, and awe is the analog of a daughter. A bereaved woman, by contrast, is one who gives birth to love and awe of God through their meditation, but those feelings do not last long, they die. So here we have it. Here are the concepts within our own heads. Again, we have prayer. Prayer is meant to focus ourselves. We're meant to be able to drive the ideas from our heads into our emotions so that we feel we're passionate about, we are energized by the ideas that we thought about during prayer. That's the concept. That's what's supposed to be happening. Head down to heart and then out to action. That's the idea. So barrenness means there's nothing there. And we're going to describe it further in just a moment. We'll get to the question in just a second. There's no energy flowing, there's no inspiration, there's no motivation. It's not there. There's no giving birth to children. You know the ideas, they're academic, but they don't bring to any action. They don't. Bereaved means that you're motivated, you're inspired, but for a short amount of time. Those emotions wear off and you find yourself back into the other space, right where they were. These are obviously extremely common. And the fact that we're dealing with these, when I first studied it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is phenomenal. We're diving into it head on. So we're going to deal with them soon. Mr. Resnick?
Yeah, my question is, you said Perek Het. Is that Perek Het in the Tanya?
No, Perek Het in the PDF of Lo Tiyeh Mishakela.
In the paper, I didn't. Okay, thank you.
Sure. So we continue in the text. So the verse therefore commands us, do not be a bereaved or barren woman, instructing us to ensure that our intellectual contemplation brings about an emotional response, which in turn lives on. only then is one's divine service considered truly proper. To further explain this idea, there are two levels of barrenness. The first is one who doesn't even have a womb, meaning a proper receptacle to receive and give life to the seed. The womb in the analog is the intellectual excitement which leads to a revealed emotional response. So a barren woman who has no womb, in its spiritual corollary, refers to someone who not only does not feel love or awe of God, which is referred to in the Chassidic texts as timtum alev, but is even incapable of intellectual inspiration, timtum hamoach. Timtum means something stuffed up. And the heart being stuffed up means that, we're simply not able to push those emotions, into practical. We don't feel particularly interested, we're not there. We know what we should be feeling, but we're not pushing it fully out. Timtum hamoach is a much worse disease, because timtum hamoach is when the mind is stuffed up in such a case that the mind simply is not willing to be moved, is not willing to be inspired. You speak to somebody and you tell them something really powerful, and their response is, so what? And there's no movement. That's a disease. That's a problem. There has to be some kind of interest, some type of feeling compelled to the subject, to the information. There has to be that kind of movement. That's a healthy person is capable of absorbing information, being moved by it in some kind of way, feeling that movement, and then afterwards taking that information and using it somewhere in their life. Question?
Rabbi, before you were talking about having love and awe, and trying to understand what you mean. For some reason, I always get stuck. There are givers and takers in the world. I know there has to be a happy medium. I haven't been able to find it, that happy medium. All right.
Okay.
Second, in other words, it just seems like right now during this pandemic, all I see is people that want to take from other people. I don't see, maybe it's my small world that I live in.
Well, here in this particular, in this essay, what we're talking about is our relationship with God. And
Okay.
so we're dealing with societal issues.
Doesn't have the ability to have that intellectual curiosity. Is it possible to open that up in that person?
That's exactly what we're going to discuss in a moment.
Okay.
That's exactly what we're going to discuss.
Okay.
So yeah, so we're all talking about basically internally rather than with regards to other people, because this entire process is something that can only happen within ourselves. It's extremely difficult to help somebody else if they don't want to be helped. But so now that we have the symptoms, we know what's happening on the outside, the lack of inspiration, the lack of motivation. Where is that coming from? Now let's understand why they're there. Once we understand why they're there, we can understand what we need to do about it. So the next paragraph talks about why they're there. So these symptoms are the result of the fact that such a person is not yet a receptacle, and not a recipient. The reason he is not capable of receiving is because his receptacle is already full of his own desires and interests. A full cup cannot absorb any more content. So when a person is full of his own desires and interests, not only forbidden desire and interest, but even permissible but animalistic desires, which are referred to as quote unquote Jewish demons, and we'll go through this in just a moment, but even holy self-interest and desires, in which a person expresses that I have a talent or interest in this divine service and therefore would rather it, but not that one. So at that point, the person becomes a full cup and is no longer capable of absorbing more. He is no longer able to absorb the truth in his mind in order to become intellectually inspired and spiritually moved. So the reason why a person experiences this idea of barrenness is because they're becoming too full of themselves. When a person, very, very practical analog, when you speak to somebody about your profession, and you're speaking to somebody who think they know everything, you can't convey anything to them. There's no conversation to be had. When you speak to somebody who's willing to receive, then that person can actually absorb the content, learn more, be inspired by something. No matter what the subject is, that's always the system. In order for a student to be a proper student, they need to be willing to learn about the subject. If they think they know everything about the subject, then there's no way for you to be able to teach. And the same thing was with regards to ourselves in terms of our connection to God. Our connection to God works in such a way that God asks us to do certain things. God says, I want you to serve me, and here's how you do it. Now, when a person puts those into his own world and says, I'm actually not interested in doing that. I'm actually interested in my own things. And here the Rebbe gave several different layers. So one layer is basically a person's own forbidden desires. Obviously, like, okay, God wants me to eat kosher, and I really enjoy pork and ribs. So that's one way of looking at it. And that's quite obvious that, in that case, well, it's obvious that a person is not going to be spiritually motivated in a complete way because the person has their own desires. God says, I don't want you doing that. And you're saying, or I'm saying, whatever it is, I'm sorry, but I want to do it. Finished. So that's obvious. But then Rebbe took it up a step and said, okay, well, let's say it's not pork and ribs, but let's say it's just I'm a real foodie. I eat fully kosher. I have no problem with kosher, but I'm just totally invested in my food. Well, in that case, a person's still spiritually lacking because of the fact that they're invested in themselves ultimately, and they're losing an element of being able to connect to the divine. The Rebbe says that's not it. There's actually an even higher level of that. Let's say you have somebody who is a truly devoted spiritual Jew, and they're completely observant in every single way possible. They do everything, and we're going to go into this a little bit more soon. They do everything possible, but they express interest and focus, and they like making the decisions about what mitzvot they want to do and which ones are like, whatever it is. Such a person is also lacking. And each one of these things are things that we can find within ourselves. These are not things that are basically simplistic, and basically we're going to look at our people in shul on Shabbos and say, okay, that person's like this. No, these are all elements within ourselves. We all do these things. And what the Rebbe is saying here is that in order for us to be truly motivated and truly driven, we need to let go of that element of our own self-interest. This is what drives the diseases of barrenness and the disease of being bereaved. And that's what we're going to talk about. The second one is bereaved here. The second type of barrenness is someone who has a womb but cannot give birth. Such a person, we're not talking about bereaved yet. We said there's actually two different types of barrenness. So barrenness, one is somebody who doesn't have any capacity whatsoever because they're simply not interested. And now we're talking about somebody who's capable, but it doesn't come to any practical outlet. They're intellectually inspired and stimulated. I had an uncle who loved studying Talmud. He absolutely loved it. He was a professor in a university somewhere, and he loved the Talmud. But he was completely unobservant. He was absolutely, in fact, you might even say anti-religious, but he loved the Talmud. His doctoral thesis was on the Talmud. So this is somebody who's obviously intellectually stimulated, but it doesn't drive them to anything in terms of their relationship with God. It didn't bring him anywhere. So the second type
Can
of
you
awareness is
explain
someone.
that?
What
Can
was
you
that?
explain how that happened? How being didn't drive the person to the next level? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about this right over here. Next
Start
paragraph, and we're going to go. Such a person feels intellectual stimulation, but it does not result in the birth of tangible emotions. This disease needs to be healed by an intense spiritual awakening. Actual impregnation of the seed needs a revelation of the power of the infinite. And likewise, one Torah and mitzvot need to be sown with such a revelation coming from beyond oneself. This refers to a deep, essential inner movement. I would translate this as a quantum movement, which must occur at least once a year at the beginning of one's avodah. So this is really something that happens on Rosh Hashanah. The idea is that basically, if I remain focused on myself and my own skills and my own passions and my own desires and my own interests, and don't connect to something beyond myself, well, then I'm still going to remain trapped within myself. I can't create something outside of myself unless I go outside of myself. And that needs to be done, like he says, with a quantum movement where basically a person realizes that the spiritual state that I've been so far is not quite enough. And we want the desire to move onwards, the desire to move out, to get out of that space is a very, very important place. This past Shabbat, we were talking about this concept at a little farbrengen we were having in Shul, and we spoke about the idea that Moses is sitting in front of on the mountain. He's got a burning bush, and he says, "Let me move away from here to see this incredible sight." Rashi says this really, really powerful statement. He says, Moses said, "Let me move away from here in order to get closer to there." Why is that powerful? Because each and every one of us want to be something greater than we are as we are right now. We want to be a greater father, a greater mother, greater husband, wife. We want to be a greater community member, whatever it is. That desire, as long as it remains in the mind, is useless. And what we need to realize is to move away from here in order to get closer to there. That ultimate picture that we want to get to, not necessarily does it even exist. But we do know we need to get closer to that. And in order to be able to do that, we need to move out of the spiritual space that I'm in and move closer to the spiritual space that I want to be. And this is part of Rosh Hashanah. This is part of Yom Kippur. This is part of the process of being able to go into ourselves and crack into that space and say, okay, it's not enough. I need to grow. I need to be in a better place. And that is the way to be able to crack the second level of barrenness. But that's not enough to have a spiritual awakening on Yom Kippur and like be all inspired and that's not enough. The next paragraph points out, but even after the seed has been sown, the days of pregnancy must be marked, in which the fetus grows from day to day in order to bring the emotions to a tangible result in the heart. So a person can go through this spiritual awakening and not do anything the day later. The point is to be able to take the ideas, take the energy, take the emotion, and to be able to spill them out into the entire week, into the entire year. And that's the reason why, of course, Tishrei has all these holidays. It's supposed to fill us up completely in such a way that we're able to take those energies and use them out and keep ourselves alive for the rest of the year. That's the idea. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchat Torah, all those, that variety of feelings and energies and experiences are meant to give us an entire year's worth of energy and inspiration and invigoration. However, even after the feelings have become revealed in one's heart with actual love and awe of God, one must still guard them that they remain alive, negating bereavement. And it is only then that one's service, divine service will be true. And so therefore, along with this entire process of recognizing what divine service is, what divine service is not, recognizing the diseases that we become afflicted with over time, over the year, and what we need to do to be able to let go of those things. Therefore, we need to make sure to continue those things, and that's where the words Be'artzecha comes up. See, the word Be'artzecha, and what we're going to talk about in this next chapter, the word Be'artzecha, of course, means in your land. The root of the word Be'artzecha is the word Ratzon, which means will. And the Talmud says about that basically that the Eretz Yisrael is known as your land because this is a land in which we fulfill your desire, your will, your interests. And so therefore there's this connection between your land and desire. So now Be'artzecha can have two different meanings to it. It can mean God's desires, or it could mean our desires. As we've just been talking about until now, our desires are that which withhold us. They hold us back from being able to grow. Even spiritual desires. And this is a very, very, very powerful idea, and this is a very, very complex concept. And here's where we said before, we said that this essay is not simplistic in terms of defining people as religious or not. It's defining people as serving God and how do we continuously serve God. And so therefore the people that we're describing here, as you see, it's not talking about like, okay, well, this person eats pork, so therefore they're not religion. This person keeps Shabbat and keeps kosher, and that therefore they are religious. This person has a beard, and therefore they're very religious. This person does not have a beard, therefore they're not so religious. All of that stuff is out the window. Because in this concept that we're talking about over here, it's a very, very internal God-person relationship in which the assessment that's being done can only be done within oneself and not outside of anybody else. And so therefore, somebody who looks the part of being incredibly religious on all different perspectives, when you assess them in this particular way, not necessarily. Likewise, somebody who you think might not be religious at all, when you assess them in this particular way, they actually might be intensely godly based on what they're capable of doing and what their knowledge and understanding is doing. So this essay is to a large degree, it's like this great equalizer where basically you cannot judge anybody anymore because the parameters of judgment don't fit. You simply can't look at anybody in a way that is assessing them in our human simplistic ways. And that's what we go over here. Let's see if we can, well, we're not going to be able to get through chapter 9, but just to be able to, and it's very, very passionate. I'd like to say the first time I was reading this, the Rebbe's tears felt like they were still on the paper. So he's very, very passionate about this concept. And what we're going to talk about specifically here is that therefore somebody, even on the highest of spiritual levels, needs to maintain this understanding that it's not about me. It's about what I need to do. And I need to put myself aside, even the greatest spiritual feelings and all that kind of thing, I need to put myself aside. I'll give you a very personal one that I'm struggling with right now, just to be able to give you context for this. My responsibilities as an Air Force chaplain are such that I'm going to need to be at MacDill Air Force Base for Rosh Hashanah. There are about 20 Jews or so on that base, and I sent out a poll and asked them when people would like to come. I'll probably have a handful of Jews that I will meet over the entire Rosh Hashanah. There's no chance whatsoever of having a minyan, especially with COVID and all that. Spiritually, I love Rosh Hashanah. I want Rosh Hashanah in a shul. I don't want to be running around the flight line of an Air Force base, to be walking around the tarmac with my shofar. That's not what I want to be doing on Rosh Hashanah. I want to be in a shul. I want to be davening. I want to be singing the songs that we all know and that kind of thing. Sitting cooped up in a hotel room for most of the day when I'm not running around it's just simply not what I want to do. And internally, I struggle with this. But I know that my job, my mission, what's expected of me, and the reason why I've been put in this position is to do something that's beyond me. And so it's the easiest thing in the world for me to call up my bosses and to say, hey, there's not really that much interest, and so it's not worth it for me to come onto base for Rosh Hashanah. I could do that, and they would say, okay, no problem. But I would be failing something much deeper. And so therefore, I have to put my spiritual desires aside in order to be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished for those people there. And this concept is applicable to every single one of us in our own worlds. And the details of it is really, we have to think about it and consider it ourselves. We have another several chapters. It gets really, really, really passionate and exciting, but obviously we've run up on our time. So any quick questions, and then I'll pass it over to Rabbi Smith.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Wonderful day, everybody. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you, Rabbi.